All right, I think we've got all we're gonna get. Maybe Jill will show up later, and as I said, Carol isn't gonna make it because she's got storm issues still. We've got a lot to talk about, so I'm just gonna turn it over to Layla, who's gonna talk budget to us. It's all yours.
Yay. All right, thanks. Nice to see everybody. I'm gonna share my screen.
Good morning, Leila.
Hey, nice to see you. I canceled a trip to Portland because I didn't want to
Smart.
get stuck.
Jill says she's working off a generator, but she's trying.
Okay, well, it'll probably take me a second to get my PowerPoint on. All right. Do y'all see the presentation screen? Is that what you're looking at?
Yep.
Okay. And I like to see all of you, so let me get my thing organized here.
And I'll keep an eye out for.
Okay,
Well,
yeah,
you two of us. Are you okay with people just asking questions rather than raising their hands? Or do you want them raising their hands? Okay.
No, it's fine. And yeah, you can feel free to ask throughout. I'll try to pause before we go through. So thanks for inviting me today. It's good timing because it's sort of okay timing. I'm just starting to get into the thick of budget, even though it's January. But that's usually when we start working on the budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And thank you, Joe, and others that shared questions in advance. It's always helpful for staff to have an opportunity to hear what you're interested in learning and then see what we can pull together. So I made a best effort to answer the majority of those questions. And then I put together some information, sort of help illustrate how important the transient lodging tax is for the city. So, okay. So at least this is kind of my hope for outcomes. You might have others, but I'm hoping to answer a lot of the questions that you put forward. I want to provide you with some factual data for consideration as you start to think about the cap in particular in the residential area. I think it's also important to understand the critical importance of this funding source and the services that we provide and what the community expects of us. And then hopefully that will help illuminate or help folks understand what the impact of the change would be on the services the city provides. So I'm going to start with some questions from the committee, just to kind of get those out of the way. And then I sort of end with some data I put together and then just some considerations for you all. So one of the questions was, what's the projected growth in STR tax revenue for the next 3 years? This you can actually find in the current fiscal year budget. So that's the 23-24 fiscal year budget. This is pulled directly from the calculations I did to get there. And the second part of that question is explain the basis. So I did this during budget and I'll do it again. So what I did was I calculated the average rate of growth pre-COVID. You'll see in some charts later that our rate of growth in terms of revenue from TLT, if that's okay, I'm just going to say TLT. We all know what that means, right? So that's the tax from short-term rentals and hotels, anything that charges for overnight stays. And between the years, fiscal years 23, 2014, and 2018, 2019, the average rate of growth was about 11%. And you can see in this chart that some years were higher, some years were lower, but that's about what we were looking at. So I started there. So, okay, it's about 11% the 5 years prior to COVID. In 2019, 2020 is a bit of an anomaly because the city shut down short-term rentals. I don't know if it was hotels, but I think just STRs. And that really impacted our revenue. So even though we were up over the previous fiscal year, we had a chunk of time, I think it went into the peak time where we weren't getting any revenue from short-term rentals. And so it was made up for once the city reopened short-term rentals. But, it skewed the data. So we also wanted to smooth out the anomalies created by COVID. And we're really, we being myself, other entities that rely on TLT to operate are still trying to figure out what the new normal is and have we reached the new normal. So there's a real need to, I think, maintain some conservatism around this, because you can see 18, 19, what was projected. So if we had sort of stayed on that trajectory of like an average, I took an average of 10% growth. So I was even a little more conservative than what the 5-year average was, which was 11. And started with the fiscal year 1920, and then increased it by 10% each year to get to the estimate I made for the current fiscal year, which was by the numbers closer to 1.4 million, but I just, again, conservative, went low. So that's how I got to 1.3 million. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Anupam, just yell it out, I think.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Just a quick clarification question. Leila, did you attempt at all to do a per unit kind of a number? So was the growth coming from just increases in number of stays, existing STRs, or did the growth come from additional STRs, etc., to try and get to a per STR number?
So no, we didn't look at it on a per unit basis. And I've looked at the data for, an annual look at all the short-term rentals and revenue, and it ranges wildly. So we have some that generate $900 a year, some that generate 5 figures a year. And so the average, the rate of growth in STRs has been in the residential zones, particular, has been incremental. I need to pull up the spreadsheet to look at it. But it isn't a one-to-one. Like, we don't add 2 units and then see the revenue go up. Like,
right.
Incrementally, I think it does that. I've gone down that rabbit hole before, and I haven't really figured out how to get fully into it.
Okay.
So
I was just thinking and just taking these numbers and dividing it by the total number of STRs in that year. That's it, not trying to do it individually. So yeah.
Leila,
and
would
you
it
could do that, but like I said, the range in terms of what they bring in revenue is very vast. So, we have a handful that actually do provide a lot of revenue, and then a lot that provide a little. So it's hard
Leila,
to say.
Would it be fair to say that from 2022 to now, the increase is not number of STRs because of the freeze? Or is it not that simple?
I don't think it's that simple. We have issued some new permits in the commercial zone since the freeze. 5 new permits have been issued in the commercial zones. But again, I don't think it's that simple. I think we saw a huge increase in utilization in that time frame. But again, that data is really hard to suss out, because you have, as you all well know, a number of individual operators, a number of for-profit operators, right? Like Vacasa and Airbnb. They all have different methodologies, different ways of doing this. So I think the fair assumption, it's an assumption, is that there's higher rates being charged and there's more utilization. I think how much of either, I don't really know. And I've asked around, and everyone kind of has the same answer. Be a great, thesis for someone to do for their master's degree or something. Like I got super nerded into it and I was like, I have to pull myself out. I'll drown.
Hey,
Michael.
yeah, I have maybe two questions and then one comment. One was, and I feel like the number has been tossed around somewhere, but the breakdown in this between hotels and short-term rentals, like is it like a 90-10, like 90% of TLT is from STRs and 10% is from the small amount of hotels we have? That's my first question.
So we don't have, and I'll talk to staff about if we can suss out the rooms, but we know how many hotels we have. And I can't remember off the top of my head, so I'm not going to say it, but it's less
5.
than, so 5. Okay, so 5. And we don't know how many rooms there are, right? So there's 5 hotels, a number of different rooms per hotel. I think it's fair to say the majority of the revenue comes from STRs.
Okay.
But I don't think hotels are insignificant.
It was in the budget somewhere. And
It's also in the Eco Northwest report. I think it's like 85-ish units in hotels or something like that.
the percent was somewhere in the budget that I read, Layla, and I don't remember what it is either, but it somehow I remember the numbers 900 for STRs and the remainder of the 13 was hotels. But again, I can't put my finger on the number, but I remember seeing that somewhere.
Yeah, I think Patrick's right. I think it's in the Eco Northwest study. So I'll look at that, but we do know that the majority are short-term rentals.
Okay, which is what I figured. I just was sometimes helpful for me to put stick a number in that brain. The second one is, and I think it's really interesting. We have the projected growth over the next 3 years, especially if we end up landing on like a 3-year reevaluation period or something like that. So it seems like there's enough confidence in forecasting for 3 years. I guess my question is, and it's okay if we don't have an answer for this, is just how far out can we forecast that before the confidence is kind of like,
Yeah, I mean, I think a good answer to that is 2 years.
Okay, right. Okay.
3 years is
so 3 years is a push.
good.
Yeah.
5 years, you're starting to push it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and in my mind, where I'm thinking about this is just when we have things like a 2039 look on, potential households or something like that, and we say, well, X amount of percentage of those could be short-term rentals, and then I think some folks, my brain included, starts to say, well, what is that? What does that revenue look if we have an anticipated growth in that? And this is my last point, was more of a comment, was just as we expect to implement, neighborhood density, proximity type of policy in the community, and it pushes those STRs further out further away from like the STR hotbed, their revenue is going to, I think it's fair to say their revenue is going to go down, right? Something that's, 2 miles from the beach is not going to it's not going to be the 5 or 6 figure STR. And so it's not like, to Anupam, when we start looking at your comment, when we start looking like a per unit basis, it becomes really complex when we start to say, well, if we bring in another 50 STRs, they're going to do this much revenue, but they're likely to only bring in X amount because they're out in the sticks, albeit in city limits. So that's all.
Yep, I think that's well stated. Thanks, Michael. Okay. So that's how I arrived at the number for this fiscal year. And then I did a projection last year. We did a forecast, our first kind of real forecast. I did a back of the envelope forecast for my first budget. And just so folks know, my first budget with the city was the 22-23 budget. And I switched screens, so I lost my place. So the forecast, I increased revenue by 6% after the current fiscal year. And so that's how we ended up with the forecast you see here, which is also again included in the city's budget. And in the city's forecast. And the reason for that is we saw a decline between fiscal years 21, 22, and 22 and 23. And so, again, being conservative, we were also at a stage where we were evaluating potential debt. And so I didn't want to paint too rosy of a picture. I wanted to have a bit of a constrained picture, in all honesty, to help support city council in making that decision. So I definitely received some feedback from the budget committee, and I expect to receive more this year, but I was too conservative in my estimates for TLT. But I can live with that for this fiscal year, and I'm open to getting feedback from the budget committee on that, but just know that feedback did come from these folks. So that's how we ended up with this forecast. My guess is it'll be a little higher, but with the current freeze in place, even though we've issued some new permits in the commercial zones, until we understand what the policy change, if there is a change going to be, we do need to operate from a place of conservation. Because looking at the data over 10 years, it isn't that a couple of STRs every year, move the needle, but we've never not had a couple STRs every year. And so it will affect our revenue. How much, I can't tell you, and I won't pretend to tell you, and I don't know that anyone necessarily could, but I do think that the impact will be felt, and it will be felt over time in particular because of the incremental impacts that the growth has on the city. And I'm sure you guys know this, but when the cap was set, it was set because that was what was the percentage breakdown at the time. I don't think there was a lot more thought put into it other than we're operating at 17.5% STRs now that we know of. We'll set the cap based on that. So for what it's worth. Another question is what's been the growth in the homes in the last 10 years? I imagine that's, that question comes from, how many STRs would have been permitted? You can see that in 2021, 22, we had some extraordinary growth. During that time, pretty unprecedented actually in our history in that short amount of time, but we are starting to get back down to sort of more normal clip, and that seems to be sustaining itself through this current fiscal year. So we're not seeing the explosive growth that we saw post or during the pandemic. We're seeing things kind of return back to normal.
Layla, can I ask you a question on that?
You bet.
So you show, it looks like 44 in over 22 and 23. Did those come after the freeze? I was just trying to calculate, 230 is where we were at the freeze. So I was just trying to figure out how many have been added since then. And that was around April 2022. So I wasn't sure if 32 was after that or.
Yeah, and these are calendar years. So
Yeah.
we put the freeze in April of 22. I'd have to look back by month. I don't know, because it could have been 8 permits were issued.
You can just estimate
when
it
I'm
from
done
this.
with my presentation, I can look it up on the list and see, because we were tracking them by quarter. We've been tracking them by year, but I'll look at that.
If you have time, a guesstimate, it would be nice. It doesn't have to be exact. That'd be awesome. Thank you. This is really helpful.
Layla, farther on, are you talking about the number of homes now and the breakout there was another question that asked how many homes currently in this zone, how many currently in that zone?
Oh, yeah, and we don't.
But that will get to Patrick's answer, I think. Question.
Yeah, of the new homes, no. So we don't know whether or not they were in what zone they were in. We'd have to map that out and do that data analysis
Right.
to tell you. But I'll come back to it, but I have a spreadsheet where I might be able to get to some of that.
Thank you.
You're gonna send me down the rabbit hole while I'm online. It's not healthy for anyone. Okay. So, one of the other questions you got is what is the number of buildable lots in Manzanita proper, not including UGB? I also assume this is a proxy for what's the capacity for new STRs in the zone. So we don't know exactly. All we have is the BLI, the buildable lands inventory from 2019. It's on our website. But I do want to note that BLI is going to be updated once the state has finalized the rules for conducting housing needs assessments. That's actually in process right now. It's supposed to be completed in January 25, and then we will do a new capacity analysis. I also want to note that our capacity is going to change too. So we are going to be implementing Senate Bill 406, the middle housing rules. That will change our capacity. And so just kind of providing a little bit more context and information for that question. We'll have a much better sense in a couple of years what our capacity is, but it should also be noted that Oregon's middle housing rules, which is what we'll be implementing, has lower requirements for parking, for example. And so those will actually be in contrast with the requirements that we have for STRs. And so it'll end up being kind of a market-driven thing on a case-by-case basis. So while I understand and appreciate the question, I think the best data source that you have is really a kind of a gross acre calculation that's in the BLI from 2019. Better data will be available to us in we'll start the work in 2025. But we should be mindful that it's not going to be like a 1-for-1 kind of thing. So it's just going to be kind of nuanced. Yeah, Michael.
I have a quick question, and I hate to put you on the spot, but do we still have like the geodatabase or shape files from that BLI? Like, I'm just wondering if we could just clip it, and then that would give us the acreage within city. And I understand a lot of that's been developed since then, so it's still going to be. I mean, we could maybe even do the math and say, well, since 2019, there's 70 homes, so remove those, clip it and then remove the 70 some odd homes just for like a quick and dirty. I think a lot of people are interested in that number.
Yeah, I mean, that takes some work on our part. If it's necessary and important information, we can pull that data. I don't think we have, I'll have to look. I don't think we have, the raster data sets because they do all this in ArcMap. And so it's there. Anyway, I can look into that. So you're saying you want to know how many homes have been built since the BLI and subtract that from the housing capacity.
Well, that was kind of an afterthought
as part of that.
Yeah, I mean, really what I was getting at was the question's been asked of me when I dug into the BLI was like, well, hey, great, thanks for telling us what could happen as the city annexes from, lands within the UGB over the next 20 years. But that's what people want to know is like right now, what's in city limits that could be developed that could increase the number of STRs. I think that's a little bit more realistic than, I think for some folks, they find that more tangible. Whereas like, I try to say, well, yeah, if the city has a UGB, they've gone through the process and then they'll just need to annex it. And it's that you should be using that as a realistic number too. But I think it's more tangible for people to say, well, but how many of those acres are of that buildable land is within city limits and could be built now? And then with your slide before, I was like, well, shoot, we know what the homes were built in that period. We could do like some rough math, but again, it's kind of so squishy that I don't know if it gets us where we need to go.
Yeah, I hear you. I think it's a little too squishy, but I'm pretty sure the BLI breaks it down between city limits and UGB. Um,
Not that we saw,
in the BLI, it doesn't?
Michael.
I didn't catch it in the final table. I could go back with a comb, but I didn't see it. It looked like it would have been real easy to do, but I didn't see it. I could reread it and look through it, but
Yeah, okay, well, let me know. I mean,
I'll look into it and
the
then
other
follow up
thing
with you.
is we've done annexations since then, so we annexed a pretty big chunk, I mean, you know, for the city, big chunk of land in the UGB. Again, I just think with data, it's always a matter of is the amount of effort to collect, compile, create worth the outcome, and especially the quality of the data. So it's now 5-year-old analysis. We're going to be changing capacity in the next year. And so, you know, I guess let me know. I'll take another look at it when I have time, but and knowing kind of how I've actually done BLIs myself when I was at Metro, I worked really hard with them on UGB expansion stuff. It's complex, but it isn't to say that we can't get at that. It's just whether or not it's the effort, the cost benefit weighs itself out. So
I get it.
feel
Thanks.
free to reach out if you have any further thoughts on it. Not to kill your dreams or anything, but so on to the next. What is the total housing stock on 12/31/23 and on the freeze date? So at the time of the freeze, at least according to our records, there were 1319 homes in the capped zones. So I guess this does answer the question. There's now 1363. So 44 have been permitted. I knew I did this math. Sorry, my brain is just since April of 2022 through December of 2023. Yeah, so you were pretty close in your guess.
And do we have total housing stock for those 2 periods? So like all zones, including C1 and R4? Basically around guesstimate around freeze, guesstimate around now. And if we don't have it here, we can, you know, maybe we can get that offline.
Yeah, most of the housing development occurred in the zone, in the cap zones. And we track it for the purpose of the cap. So I would have to ask Scott if there were other residential permits issued. There's one on Lanita right now, a house that's being built. Is not
So-
included in.
Yeah, right behind Michael. So 44 homes were permitted, but not 44 additional homes because of the freeze. So if 44 were permitted and we're down 5 from when the freeze went in, that means 49 homes dropped off?
No, so 44 homes were permitted for construction.
Ah, okay, thank you.
No permits were issued
Gotcha,
for that 40 in the R zone, in the cap zones.
right. And do you have the numbers for the C1 R4?
No, I don't.
I think she
And
said no.
I'm pretty sure, I need to ask Scott, but I'm pretty sure that other than the one being built on Lanita, they've all been built in the other
Okay.
zones. There's ones in the commercial district behind left coast.
Not the permanent homes. What we're looking for is how many homes are there in the C1 and R4? We don't know that number.
1360. Oh, the
That's
C1 and
outside.
R4. I don't know.
Okay,
And just as a sidebar, the reason we're trying to figure that out is, you know, we're taking a look at kind of density and neighborhood initiatives, and then kind of trying to use those to manage what we've done in the past with C1 and R4. We're talking about those ideas, and we're talking about trying to figure out how many STRs we would have based on a percentage idea or based on a total idea. And we can't do that until we know basically total housing. So I know we've always calculated it in kind of the residential zones, the cap zones, but to consider this kind of hybrid approach going forward, and to figure out which process, you know, puts the most or least pressure on the budget. Trying to get the total number will give us an easy way to get the percentage and the actual change in short-term rentals.
I totally don't understand what you just said, but I did hear
Here, let me
that
give
you
you,
want to
let me read
know.
it.
Okay,
So if
but
we're
let
gonna
me
if we're
make
gonna
sure
try
I
to,
understand what you're asking for is the number of housing units currently in the C1 LC and the R4, so the
Right.
unrestricted
Yep.
zones.
Right.
Okay, and then you'd also like to know the number of STR permits in those zones. I think
No,
that's
we-
fairly easy to pull together. Yeah. So we'll work on that. We'll pull that for you. I know I have one part of the equation, but not the other, so. Okay.
thank you.
So one of the other questions was, can you give us the breakdown of the last 10 years revenue for STRs and hotels? So we don't, like I said, we don't have that data by that category. We don't split it out that way. We're in a place now where, you know, we've brought the program into the 21st century, so we're able to collect data. For us to go back 10 years would be an enormous, again, that cost benefit is just too high. So we can't do that. We can, but we just don't have capacity to do that in a meaningful time frame. But what I can share with you is the total, you know, the amount of that TLT we've collected every year. I think it's important to remind folks that it's both general fund and the restricted tourism dollars, and then there's a total, right? So general fund is, you guys know this, saying this for the benefit of others that are watching, is the first 7% of the 9% TLT, and then 30% of the remaining 2% of that 9% goes into the general fund. 70% of the 2% goes into the tourism promotion fund. And then those two things combined are our total TLT revenue. So this chart, actual general fund means the TLT that goes in the general fund, actual TLT is the money that goes into the restricted fund. So it's grown a lot.
Yeah, quick question, Leila, just so I understand the numbers. Previously, you under 2020, 22, 23, we had STR revenue of 1.27. I'm trying to understand how that fits into these numbers for 22, 23.
I think those were projections.
Those are projections, yeah. So I'll go back to that, yeah. So when I was projecting for this year, I said, what if we lived in a world where there wasn't COVID and we only grew by 10% each year to today, which was last fiscal year? Where would that land us? So that's what this says. This isn't the actuals, this is projected so that I could get to a number for today, trying to smooth out that curve. So thank you for bringing that up. Does that clarify? So this was like,
well, I'm still a little confused. So the number here that I'm seeing 22, 23, the 1.269, the actual was like 1.5 or something that I'm seeing in the other chart?
that's correct.
Okay.
Yes, this is the actual.
So we had budgeted that and we ended up with 1.589. Is that correct?
Yeah, we actually budgeted
1.8.
1.1 for that year. That chart I was just looking at was how I arrived at the 1.3 I estimated for this current fiscal year. So it was all imaginary. It wasn't exactly, but it wasn't what the projections were. Those are actually quite different. Like 2021, for example, I think we estimated, no, 21, 22, we estimated like 850. This is before I got here, 850,000. We ended up with 1.6 million. 22, 23, I thought I was being brave and I estimated 1.1. We ended up with 1.5. So that chart I showed you before, I'm sorry if that's confusing, but that's just kind of how I just wanted to show you all the math, how I ended up with 1.3 million for the current fiscal.
So these are the
year.
actual numbers that we're seeing here. That
These are yeah, and this is all pulled from the audit. So these are all audited
And so we
Fine.
collected, as an example, in 21-22, we collected 1.890231, and of
Yes.
that, we kept 1,628,971.
In the general fund, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
You bet.
I think
Thanks for
I think it's
clarifying that.
just important to note that COVID really impacted your projection. I mean, you look at the progress over years of how this budget increased, and I think your projections were right on. They're conservative, but they're in the budget. And then we have this big bleep there, which ended up with excess funds, so that's good. But I'm not sure we should assume that that kind of growth or that kind of income is going to happen year after year after year. So I think being conservative with those estimates is probably, in my opinion, a more sound numbers to kind of play with as we go forward or consider. That's just my thought. Because when we talk about this, and also with the urban growth boundary and such, I think we had profound growth in the last few years, which was not which was a direct result of what was happening all around us, nothing in our community in terms of societal, in terms of COVID, people couldn't travel, all those things that we all know are true. And who knows now what will happen if things are, back to normal and people are taking different trips and choosing to go elsewhere. I mean, so I think the projected numbers make more sense to me at this point as we consider this budget, just long-term and for stability.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, and I totally agree. I feel so lucky I got to come in when there was a pandemic and nothing's the same and all of it's crazy. And so anyway, so I appreciate that comment. I agree. And that's, yeah, we'll see how it goes through the budget process, but I do anticipate proposing a more conservative approach, which is why I ended up saying 6% growth going forward. Because if you look back on the history, I've been looking back about 10 years. That's a safe bet. Okay, so what's the incremental cost to the city adding a new home? I don't have an answer. I don't know. That's a hard sort of nebulous thing to wrap your eyes around and mind around. And so I'm just gonna say I don't know. I don't know. Sorry. What is the city's position on hotels in the city, and do you see an increase in this? Are there restrictions? So the city's position is kind of what our policy documents and our enabling ordinances allow, right? So I don't make that decision. We'll be talking about that as a community as we consider the update to our comp plan and then translating those changes into the ordinance. So ultimately that comes down to the community and the city council's position. My job's to kind of implement the current policy and the current ordinances. And so hotels are allowed by right in the commercial, the limited commercial, and the seasonal recreational zones. So you can build a hotel in any of those zones outright. So it's an outright use. There are specific guidelines in each zone. And those are outlined in the MZO. And I started to put together some charts and then was just like, I don't have time. So they sort of there's height limits, there's dimensional limits, so all those things. And I'm sure this is another attempt to try to get at capacity. So that's the answer to that question. I love this idea. Is there opportunity to get more user fees? I'd have to do a little more digging on this with legal and like what we can and can't do. But there's always administrative costs associated with collecting more fees. But I did want to know, we did raise the renewal fee pretty significantly this year. And we expect to see a pretty big increase in revenue because of it. We did have a handful of folks that gave up their permits because of it, but then those just got eaten up pretty quickly. So, yeah. So there's
just a clarification on that. The question really was to ask whether we're legally allowed to add on a user fee if we wanted to.
Yeah, I I don't know, and I didn't tap legal to ask, and if it's important enough, I will do that.
Thank you.
I had a question. Did you, in your projections, did you take into account this increase of fee renewals when you looked
So
at projected income?
Yeah, we did for, and I'll show you a chart. Well, I guess it was for last fiscal year. So we did for this fiscal year. I think our fees went up at least $120,000 to account for that. So yes, yeah. So for the current fiscal year, but it won't be reflected in the past fiscal years because that went into effect this fiscal year. It went into effect in August. We did send out the renewals a little earlier than should have been done. And so actually some of that revenue ended up recording in last fiscal year, which frustrates me a little. And then, but most of it fell into the current fiscal year. So I'll actually be talking to the budget committee about this next week. Why did we underestimate licenses and fees? And like, what? We collected data and it got posted a little earlier than we anticipated. So that won't happen again, but that is it may end up being a little less than what we estimated for this fiscal year because it ended up in last fiscal year.
Does that $100,000 go into the add to the 1.6 million in the general fund, or does it go into a different category?
It's a different category. So it's and I'll show you kind of, I have a breakdown of all the different revenue sources for the general fund.
Yeah.
It goes into licenses and fees.
Okay, I know where that is.
Yeah, we track that separately. Michael, did you have a question?
I did. It was actually on maybe the last slide or the one before it around. No.
I don't know what direction you're pointing.
Oh,
Here?
no, it was one that
What's the
before. It was,
question?
yeah, it was about the budget, and I guess what and it might have been, my question too, but it's certainly a question I have, and I know some other folks on the committee were thinking about too, is just as we're trying to make a decision on a couple things, policy on how the numbers grow, right? And a separate policy on what is that upper limit. At least for what is helpful for me is to have, this real clear, clearly defined sandbox, and you have an upper boundary where the community says, no more, I can't stomach this, or and then a lower bound that says we can't go below this number or else we won't have the revenue we need. And so in lieu of yeah, it wasn't this one. Sorry for, let me go back one more slide.
I might get to that answer at the end. Some data I pulled together. If I don't, let's circle back. And
Sure.
I know you have a pretty hefty agenda today, so I want to make sure I don't take up too much of that time.
If you're getting there,
but I also,
it.
it's important. This is important information, and I'm very happy to provide it. So I don't want to rush you, but I just want to be mindful. So Michael, if I don't answer that question later, let's come back to it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so then there were some questions about STR revenues, percentage of general funds for the current, so we don't have any of that data yet necessarily. We are pulling in Q2, so well, it's actually Q4, which is the second quarter of our fiscal year. Those are due at the end of this month. So we'll have more information at the end of the month, and I can provide that in writing to you guys once we have it. But we're tracking really well. What I can tell you is that Q3, which is Q1 for our fiscal year, we were in line with where we were the previous year. So we're doing pretty good in that sense. And then when, to get at the rest of these questions, like we just won't have that data until the audit's done at the end of the calendar year. So I'm going to jump into some slides I put together. I hope I answered as many of the questions as I could. And maybe Joe, if there's follow-ups, I tried to take some notes, but if there's follow-ups, you could send those to me and I'll do my best to get those back to y'all in a timely manner.
Yeah,
So-
and let me just add to the committee, if you have follow-up questions, send them using the STR Google email, so we can all see them, and then after, let's say, a couple days, we'll send them on to Layla.
Yeah, thanks. It was helpful to have them all consolidated, and if I'd had more time, I probably could have dug into some, but I think I got most of it, so I feel pretty good. All right, so I put together some data, because this is starting to get me thinking about budget and projections, so thanks for kicking me in the pants. So TLT, how important is it? Well, it is the greatest revenue source for the city, hands down. It is the most important revenue source for the city, whether we like it or not. We're just built on it. We're actually really fortunate because we get to keep like that 7%. I mean, there would just be services we can't provide if we didn't have it. And I wanted to highlight what is paid for from the general fund itself. But first, let's go through and talk about what is in the general fund. So the general fund, this is the breakdown for fiscal year 22-23. This comes from our audit. Property taxes. So most cities have a much higher proportion of their revenue coming from property taxes, like half. We don't have that here. Intergovernmental agreements, so that represents any IGAs we have to provide service. So the ones you might be familiar with are our police contracts with Wheeler, Nehalem, and Oregon Parks and Recreation. Licenses, fees, and permits. So Cheryl, this is where that revenue from the licenses go. And again, this doesn't reflect the increase this last fiscal year, but it does reflect a teeny chunk of it. Franchise fees. So this is, oh, go ahead.
But won't that number significantly increase in the next few years because of this increase in rentals or the fees? Because if we've gone from 150 per STR to 850 correct me if I'm wrong, that's like 3 times more. That's almost 4 houses more per house than we've been getting.
Yeah, so let's read the yes, it increases a lot, like 100, but proportionally to the rest of the budget, it's
exactly
it's 100, and I think we estimated sorry, I'm gonna do the math here because I have
well, that's what I was doing, but I get the percentage is still going to be smaller, but the dollar amount is going to be significantly greater.
Yes, it is 6 figures greater, right?
Yes, yes,
yeah, it will change. And so next audit, that number should be up. And you'll see that in my budget for this year too. It'll be a higher number. And so that's going to help offset some things that we're taking on, like debt for City Hall, for example.
Okay, I see that.
So thank you. So that's licenses, fees, and permits. Franchise fees. So those are the fees that, I think it's just right now it's Comcast and RTI and PV. State liquor and cigarette taxes. So if it's 0%, it means it's just less than 1% of the overall. So we do get some scratch from it, but it's not much. I think cigarette taxes were like $600 last year, and liquor tends to be, the sin taxes tend to be like $12,000 to $13,000 total. State revenue sharing, so that's a proportion of resources we get from the state based on our per capita. So the 600 people that live here. So this is where I just want to shake my fist, because we have an effective population that's, between 5 and 10 times that, depending on the time of season, but we only get revenue based on our permanent population. Grants and contributions. So these are grants that we may receive. You will see this number go up this fiscal year. Please stay. Excise taxes, we receive excise tax, but then we actually paid out, so then the being a bit of a wash. STR, so our audit list is the short-term rental tax. I'm going to talk to them next year and make sure it's transient lodging tax, because that's what it is. But 64% of our budget last year was, I'm sorry, of our resources came from STR. Fines and forfeitures, so these are things like parking tickets and other fines, things like that. Rents and leases, we haven't really gotten any revenue from that in quite some time. Investment earnings are all over the place, so we have, that varies between years. We have capital that's, sits in an LGIP account. That's where we keep all of our money, and we earn interest on that. And then we divide it up. And then other just kind of random revenue sources, which are few and far between. And then we do get transfers, and transfers for those right now come from the building fund and the water utility. And that's to pay for the services that are provided to those enterprises. So that's what makes up the general fund. So proportionally, right, 46% of all these other funding sources, and then 64% is STR. So it's the majority. And if you go back, you can see it's tracked above 50% for the last 10 years for the most part. We had 2017, we saw a bit of a decline, but for the majority of the time, it's more than half of our revenue.
Can I just ask a quick question? I'm just getting confused a little bit. So this is percentage of general fund, and the prior graph said percentage of city budget. So this is this a percentage of? Is this the exact same?
Saying, yeah, sorry, that should clarify that. I mean, how important
this is general fund, right?
Well, it actually is important to the city's budget, and if you let me continue, you'll see why. So
my apologies.
That thought, good point. I love your sort of zeroed in focus. It's painful, but it's good. So thank you for that. So this is where the general fund comes from, and what does it pay for? It pays for like everything, pretty much. There's some things it doesn't pay for, right? So the water utility and the building fund pay for certain activities, but every service that is provided by the city is either fully or partially funded by the general fund or by staff who are paid by the general fund, who provide direct or indirect services to the city's enterprise funds, such as the water fund and the building department, right? And the general fund has also historically funded the majority of road or storm projects. So the big project we just finished on Dorcas, those road funds came from the general fund. A lot of the storm funds to build that came from the general fund over time. These were transfers that were made out of the general fund into capital project funds. And it's just important to remember that. It covers 69% of all staff. So this is in the city's budget. What I've outlined in red are the percentage of the full-time equivalent staff that are paid directly out of enterprise funds. So I think there might be a misconception, for example, that all public works is paid out of the water fund. Well, they're not. 35% of our utility workers are actually paid from the general fund to provide the services related to roads, parks maintenance. They also TLT tourism I included. So I should say that TLT, which is not general fund, also pays for, but it's the same thing, right? It's the same source of money. So I should clarify that I mean 69% of all staff are paid out of the general fund or the transient lodging tax that's restricted. So I'll be very clear. And that number is going to go up next year. And I'll talk more about that in the budget process, but we are eliminating half an FTE in the building program. And so that dependence, I think it's a bad word, but the reliance on that general fund or TLT is just going to go up next year. So it's critical to everything that we do. And I think just to further, so it's not just staff, right? It pays for our planning program. It pays for the short-term rental programs, the staff that run that, and all of the requirements we have to do those things. So that's paying for things like the software that we use to manage the revenue, and the permits and all of that. The general fund pays for the city attorney. The general fund pays for information technology, which is, we'll see kind of there's been an increase in administrative overhead. A chunk of that has come from our increased need and demand from the public to provide, I mean, doing exactly what we're doing now, right? Or having an IT professional help us live stream videos and do all the things we need to do to be responsive to our community. It also pays for the professional services, so finance, planning, the comp plan, all of those things are paid out of the general fund. It pays for the judge, pays for all of our emergency management, and then all that materials and services within the department budgets are paid out of the general fund. The road fund does get money from gas tax. It's fairly small relative to the overall cost. We transfer about 100 grand or more a year into the road fund to make it solvent. So this, I have sort of a couple more slides and then we'll end, but this shows kind of the annual total resources that the city has and compares it. And this is all actuals. This is all pulled from the city's audits for the last 10 years and total requirements. And I think I operate better visuals, have charts with this obviously, but I figured this would be an easier way to see things. Things you need to be thinking about are areas where that dark blue line is, sorry, did I do the inverse here? Yeah. Is where the light blue line is higher than the dark blue line, or they line right up. So this gets to a question I think both Cheryl and Michael hit on, is what do we need in order to operate? Well, you need at least that, right? You need to be at least equal to what you're bringing in on an annual basis to what you're spending on an annual basis. And so these are actuals. So this is areas where we didn't actually bring in as much as we spent. You're like, how did we operate? Well, we do have, well, we didn't have in these fiscal years a reserve, but we had an unappropriated ending fund balance. So we do have kind of what we call carryover. But we don't want to rely on carryover, right? We want to be able to provide services on an annual basis based on the annual revenue that's coming in. One of the things that I did when I got here is set up a policy reserve for the city to say that, okay, we're going to budget to this. And then we're also going to we'll get to 25% on top of that. So if we spend $1 million, we also we want our budget to actually be $1.25 million, and that we have to bring in enough revenue to cover that. And that's just good practice. And then everything else above that, I think it's good to have some money in kitty, but then those are resources that we can use for other things eventually. But to be in a healthy financial position, we want more revenue than we're spending every year, including our reserve. So this doesn't include the reserve. This is just actuals. So we had a couple of years over the last 10 years that were like, that's kind of dicey. We had more years where we did better than we brought in more resources than we spent. And that starts to build up our, our savings essentially. And
Layla, can I just make a comment that our city manager arrived right around 2020? Thank you very much.
It's actually I arrived in 21 in June.
Yeah.
But I didn't do that budget. So my first budget was 2022.
Yeah, I'm just looking at we got a good reserve now.
We do. And we also have a policy reserve now, so we're actually obligated to, this year, I think we've put away either 17.5 or 20%, we get ourselves up to 25%. And then that becomes part of the total requirements that we need in order to maintain sort of our financial health. The thing I want to note about this chart is that it's going down, right? Revenue is going down between 22 fiscal years, 22 and 23. And we are starting to plateau in terms of our expenditures. So this is where, when we start talking about limiting our biggest source of revenue, I start to get a little nervous, because I'm like, okay, what does that mean for us long term? We are in a pretty solid shape. I think we're going to be in solid shape for some time, but that is based on a history of incremental growth over time. So the conclusions I drew from this are that, I think it's obvious the TLT represents the single most important funding source for the majority of city services. The cap has resulted in modest, so we've been used to modest growth over time. But that modest growth has contributed to our overall solvency, or overall, even those dark years that you saw where we were spending more than we were bringing in, it was the carryover from the previous years that allowed us to do that. I think it highlights we need to diversify, right? We've been talking about this as a theory, but in practice, like, we need to diversify. I think, to the points a couple of you have already made, that next fiscal year will show some improvements with increases to development related fees and short-term rental fees. So staff is actually bringing proposals to City Council in February to update the master fee schedule. And so there's going to be a huge number of changes, mostly directed towards new development. But the STR fees, as noted by Cheryl and others, that's going to make a difference, but it's not going to make, over time, it won't necessarily be what grows the city, but it will help diversify how we're funding ourselves. I would argue that limiting TLT coming in will impact us, and it needs to be backfilled somehow, so that we can ensure that at a minimum the annual growth is keeping pace with inflation, which the last couple of years is a lot harder to do than we're projecting for this year. We're tracking about normal right now. I think the CPI, last I checked, is hovering around 3.5%. And alternative funding sources for infrastructure become even more necessary. The city's practice, I did an analysis of the transfers that we've done into other departments and infrastructure funds. We have paid for infrastructure with the general fund and basically TLT. We can't keep doing that if we're going to maintain our solvency and if we are going to limit our own revenue source that we have. So it just increases the pressure for us to think about what alternate sources are available to us. So those are my conclusions, and I'll stop sharing screen now. And I've gone way over my time, so I'm happy to take any questions, or if you want to just move on to your next agenda item and send me some follow-up, I'm happy to take that.
As you said, any other specific questions on data, we can get to her. Let's say the end of by Friday of next week. I'll send something to Layla by Friday of next week. So if you get your questions to me before then, I can always I will already tell you mine is how many homes in the C1 R4 zones. Layla, do you have a total number of homes in Manzanita? Homes?
Yeah, I don't remember what it
Yeah.
is, but I can
Okay.
pull it from water connections.
Right. Okay.
Oh,
That
that's all
would
we
get
need.
to it too, because then we can subtract.
Yeah, it's the easiest way.
Any other questions for now, Annapol?
Yeah, just I guess maybe more of a comment than anything else. First of all, Layla, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
I guess the one question I would have is, because this is something, and you touched on it, something we've we've talked about in the committee. What I heard today in today's presentation, there's too many variables floating around right now. There's too much uncertainty in terms of how things will work out, whether it be middle housing or other things, et cetera, all these pieces. And as you've done a great job in building up a little bit more, I guess, of financial stability in this equation. One of the debates obviously is limiting the number of STRs. So, and what we, at some point, we'll need to have some sense of how would you advise the committee to think about, I guess, that limit, if you want to call it, because ultimately it's a big funding source, and that's the way Manzanita is set up. And until we find other alternatives, that's going to be our primary source, let's call it. So, I mean, we're wrestling with this whole issue of, and you've heard the questions about what's the tap? How much do we do? Anyway, it's more of a comment than anything else, but thank you for the data that you provided us.
Yeah, and I think just a quick response to that, we already limit the number of permits, right? We're frozen, but we already have, we have since 1990. Correct, 5 limited that. And that was based on kind of what was in place, right? They were like, how many STRs do we have now? How many houses do we have? Okay, 17.5%, let's do this. So we already, I think it's important we acknowledge and recognize that we already have a mechanism in place. The question is, does that work? And if it doesn't, then finding what works about it, and I'm not advocating, okay, that's not what I'm doing here, but what I am saying is that we have a mechanism. And it allows for modest incremental growth. And I'm hoping what I showed you today is that modest incremental growth is necessary and critical to the city to be able to provide services. Any reduction in that would result in a reduction in service. That's just, I hope that's clear from the data. So whatever method you choose, I do believe it needs to require some allowance for either annual or biannual incremental growth, because as we've seen, anything can happen in this community, right? Anything can happen. And there's a lot of variation in how much the number of permits can create in terms of revenue that we have absolutely no control over. We don't control price. We don't control number of nights, so utilization. So having some flex in there has done the city good. So I guess that would be the only response to the comment I have, is that there is a mechanism. It's been working. It's been doing what it was intended to do. So as you consider other options, that would be the thing I would strongly encourage and advise, is to say, there's got to still be some measure of incremental growth that happens over time. And that's the challenge that you're being asked to address.
So
Can I say something on that?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Patrick.
Well, I'll be honest, as I listen, you're making me kind of nervous and kind of fearful about the future of this city. And I wonder if there are also positive aspects to it. I mean, I think we have a AA- credit rating from S&P Global, which is better than several states in the United States. They look at Manzanita as kind of a functioning leader in municipalities. And I think our team, I think we're all on the same page. I don't think this is a team that wants to take away revenue from you or the city. And I don't see that any of the things that we're talking about are going to do that. And when you say slow growth, I just want to make sure I understand. Are you talking about slowing growth on revenue?
think I said
Like I
incremental.
think that
growth.
the assumption is that if we slow the number of STRs coming, that's going to slow or reduce revenue. But what we found is, like, in the last 5 years, STRs have gone up 6%, but STR revenues doubled. It's gone up from 900,000 to 1.8 million, right? So almost a million increase. So that's during a period of relatively stable STR, increases. So I just hope that we all kind of try to find a balance. I hope we recognize too that you've created something for our city that we're forever grateful for. I mean, you've put us in an amazing place, and I'm just not so sure that the sky is falling. And I don't think this committee wants to put you in a position where people have to, where we have to make any cuts whatsoever. I don't see us doing that. But it is an interesting position we're in because we're asked to thread the needle. And that 17 point, you said something really important, which is this 17.5% kind of still working? And right now, when you look at all the communities on the North Coast and Central Coast, there's only one city that self-protects, that self-regulates. It has a percentage of short-term rentals to houses that's higher than us. So I think we do have to kind of look at this and go, is this working? And is this sustainable for livability as well as the budget? How do we keep the budget growing, but how do we protect, our neighbors as well?
Well, and I want to be clear, I'm not trying to put fear into you. It's just my responsibility is to manage the city's resources with the oversight of the budget committee and the council. That's an enormous responsibility. And so what is incumbent on me is to demonstrate and to, with data, with factual information, the impacts of those funding sources are for us. And I have to be thinking about not today, but 10 years from now. I may not be here in 10 years, but I want to make sure that the city's rocking in 10 years. And so what I come from is a place of cautious optimism. I think that the controls we have in place have done us well, and I think have not overburdened our community the way that it has in other places where it was totally unregulated. And I won't name names, but we have some folks south of us that didn't regulate, and what a difference that has made. And thank you for pointing out the bond rating. It's been A- and increasing because we now have a policy reserve. And so taking these
really awesome.
steps, yes, thanks for that. So we are doing great. And the work that I think this committee has done to address and will continue to do livability, to me, those are the mechanisms in which we can help address the negative impacts or perception of negative impacts that come from this revenue source. It's also what makes our community great, right? So it's sort of a thing. So I want to leave you with a sense of cautious optimism. We're doing great. We have mechanisms that work. How do we do this in a way that balances that and allows us to continue to do what we're doing without putting us in a position where 5 years from now we'll be regretting something? So I have to be that person. That's my job, and I get paid to make sure that folks are aware of what the impacts will be in the future. But
I think one of the keys, and you brought it up, is, and Patrick and Annapom spoke to it also, there are enough unknowns with the buildable lands and with middle housing that they're just, whatever we suggest to the council and whatever forms it takes, it has to include this needs to be revisited if things change.
Right.
And this, if we set, even if we said, we're going to do this for the next 5 years, in 3 years, if there's a significant change, the council has to be able to, and the committee needs to be able to say, whoa, we need to look at that again. And that's key. Leila, again, thank you so much.
I'd just like to say something before we let Leila go. First
Okay.
of all, I sincerely appreciate the time and energy that Layla put into getting us this information. It took a lot of time to do this, and I'm hoping that this can go on the website as soon as possible, because I think the information that Layla shared with us is critical. Secondly, I'd like to point out that the short-term rental committee has really done an excellent job of providing tools that help us manage the livability in Manzanita. You've provided educational information. We have a code enforcement officer. We did a survey that shows that about 80% of the city of Manzanita is okay with where we are right now. So I just think we need to be cautious as we move forward, and to remember that the city council is pretty much in line with where Layla is right now. We know how important the short-term rental revenue is, and we're going to be very cautious about making any major changes. So I think the analytical evaluation, the kinds of data that the short-term rental committee is looking at, is really critical for us, for the city council, in order to make a final policy decision. So I think this additional information from Layla is critical. I think her advocacy for making sure that the future is financially sound is really important. And I think the short-term rental committee is taking that into account as we move forward. So I think this is timely, great, and thank you, Layla, for doing the work you did to give us the data that will help us move forward with the committee's next steps.
Yes. I underline that, can we get it on the recording on the website as soon as possible sometime? I promised it to Carol, and Jill is also going to need it because obviously her generator wouldn't let her get on. So
Well,
for
and
them,
I plan to revisit it. I mean, I think.
yeah, exactly.
Go
Yeah.
back to.
And I couldn't take notes fast enough.
Yeah, right.
I'll reach out to Josh and I'll PDF this presentation too and get that online.
Oh,
And
that would be
you're
great.
very welcome. Thank you for the really smart, hard questions. It's always fun, and that's what I'm here for. I'm here to help. So thanks for reaching out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do some of the next stuff on the agenda pretty quickly, so we give Michael a chance to get into what some of you have been working on for the past couple of weeks. I showed the city council last week the brochure and the window film. Hey, Mikey, they liked it, which is no surprise to me. There was a couple questions that came up. One was the timeline for distribution, and we also talked about whether or not it should be mandatory for all STR homes, and the council agreed it should be. That requires a ordinance tweak, because in the required postings, it actually spells out specifics rather than saying post everything the city says you should post. So we need to change the ordinance. That's a first reading, a second reading. That's going to take a little bit of time. I'm hopeful, Linda, while we do that, we can also include the change to the wording on the signage on the outside. We said visible from the street. It should say readable from the street.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think we've all agreed that that's important. We talked about who should sign the cover letter, and how it should be addressed, and it's going to be addressed, "Dear good neighbor," because that's who we're sending it to. And it'll be signed by Catherine, our new mayor, and the short-term rental committee. Is that okay with all you guys? Okay. We talked about sending it to all the UGB areas, and the council agreed that was a great idea. And then Mike Sims from the police department came back and said, or Eric, I'm not sure who, said, no, that's a bad idea, because the phone numbers on both the window film and the brochure show the Manzanita Police non-emergency hotline and the code enforcement officer number, and those numbers are not for the UGB. UGB calls an 800 Tillamook County line. or Tillamook County, because the Manzanita Police Department and the code enforcement don't serve the UGB. So they asked that we not send it to the UGB people. So.
Joe, are you
Yeah.
gonna work on the language in the ordinance, the visibility from the street and the window film? Are you
I'll
gonna
talk to Layla. My guess is that she would like to do it.
Okay.
In the past, the actual ordinance language is easier to come from her because she's more,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Regarding our future direction, that the council asked, how long should we be, whatever plans we come up with, how far ahead should they be looking? And despite the different stuff that needs to be considered, we should be, her request was that we should be looking at least 5 years, and she would prefer 5 to 10 years. So we need to, when we're thinking about what are we trying to do, we're trying to think of what are we trying to do that will be good for 5 to 10 years. That doesn't mean that we can't say, here's our plan, we've considered the next 10 years, and part of that plan means that the council, if there's any major changes in housing or environment, should revisit whatever we've decided. But just think of what's good for the next 5 to 10 years. The council determined that July would be best for a presentation. That gives them a chance to do the budget, because everybody from the council is also on the budget committee. So they're going to be kind of busy in April and May, and that works for us, I think. So we can present in July, and that brings me to the timeline. Any questions on the city council meeting before I go to the timeline? Okay. The timeline is going to be a little confusing in that we've kind of changed, well, we have changed the draft document. So some of these focus areas are going to be like, what's a focus area? Can you all see this? I know it's not really big.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
By the way, the previous document that we were working on and this version of the document we are working on is, I think there was some feelings by some people that the document was a fait accompli. So why bother commenting, because, hey, it's already been written. That was so far from what it was meant, and I apologize if that was the impression that was given. It was more of a, here's some talking points, because if we didn't have the talking points, we would tend to just talk in general concepts and talk in circles. Not that we don't sometimes anyway, but having the talking points keeps us a little bit better focused. But if you have an opinion, if you have comments, if you disagree, if you agree, tell us, because they're just talking points, and we are a committee and we need to hear everybody's input to get something that's going to work for all of us and it's going to work for the city. So the timeline. Today we talked about the budget, the timeline. Michael's going to talk about the process and give a quick run through on the updated, I'm going to call them talking points. So I've divided this into during the meetings and between the meetings. Between the meeting, we're going to add the budget numbers that Layla has given us to the draft, and then we'll post that on the Google Doc, so you'll all be able to look at it and comment on it. I'd like everybody to read it, and then if you have questions, again, using the Google email so everybody can see your questions, put any questions you have by the 10th, not by February 15th. That makes it really hard. So if you have questions by the 10th, And then prior to the meeting by the 12th. Which way are you leaning? Area 2 is, should we include the C1 in the R4 zone? Which way do you lean on that? It's not binding. We're not taking a vote. It would just help if we find out, for instance, that everybody on the committee says, nope, we don't want to include the C1 and R4 in any percentage or cap. Our conversation during the meeting will be much shorter. If everybody says, yeah, we do, again, shorter meeting. If we're divided, then we know that's going to be a little bit longer discussion. Same thing. What's your leaning on area on focus area 1? Focus area 1 is whether we do a cap, whether we do percentage, what are the different options within that? So which way are you leaning? How do you feel? Questions on that? I saw at least one puzzled glance. Okay. So then, once we do that, on February 16th, the next meeting, we'll talk about focus area 2, the C1R4, whether to include them, and then we'll see if we can come to some kind of consensus. We might not, that's okay. But we're going to try. And then we'll talk about focus area 1, the cap and percent options. Between the February meeting and the March meeting, again, what numbers would you lean towards for when we get down to specific numbers? If we have a percentage, what should that percentage be? If we have a cap, what should that cap be? Are there exact numbers we should put in for growth? Then we'll discuss it on March 15th. In between, do you have any ideas for density and proximity? Circulate them. There's already a couple around going out there. If you have an idea today, put it out there. It doesn't have to wait until April 1st. We're not going to discuss it in the group until April 19th. But if you've got ideas beforehand, don't wait till April 1st. One of the ideas is a halo concept, and it's a little confusing to me. So I asked Patrick if he would do a little Zoom presentation on how that works. And we don't have a date for that yet, but we'll get a date as we get closer. And then we'll have the discussion. In May, we'll review all the decisions and then offline prepare a PowerPoint presentation. I left June open, and then July. Linda, would this be a workshop presentation or a council meeting presentation?
I think it would be a workshop presentation.
So that would be in the middle of the month.
Right.
Okay.
I think it's the 15th, if I remember correctly. I'll check.
Questions? Anupam?
Just a quick question to make sure I understand. Well, I actually have a comment on the content. I'm fine with the conversation. I'm a little puzzled by the addition of the, I guess, discussion on density and proximity, because that's a pretty robust issue to deal with. And if the purpose of that is to better, I guess, improve the livability side of the equation,
Mm-hmm.
and address that, then I would like to make sure we also include some of the other ideas we've talked about, how to improve livability by changing some of the rules or adjustments. So I guess what I'm wondering is whether we should take care of this cap versus percentage or whatever issue first, and then deal with all of the other ideas that we have for improving livability, including density and proximity, etc.
I don't think this precludes that. I think in the talking points draft that we have, at the bottom are, I can't remember what they call it when they're doing the, when you're doing meetings, parking lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the bottom, we have a parking lot. And that parking lot is listing a lot of those ideas. And I think some of them, you're right, we can add in. Some of them, we can say, yes, that's a great idea. We need to do this, and let's put it in a future. You know, we're not gonna disband at the end of July. So we might do it in August or September. But so we may include some of them in the July presentation, and we may not. And I think that we can, yeah, say if you have any, and I'll put it in here, if you have any additional things that would help livability, circulate them too. For now, we'll put them in the parking lot, but we may and likely will take some of them and bump them up to the actual presentation, do this too. I mean, we kind of did that with density and proximity. We originally had density in the future issues, and it got moved in because I think we all realized that you got to do that too at the same time. Does that
I
work?
think we, yeah, yes, I mean, it's an important issue, but I also think it's a very complicated issue.
Absolutely.
And to define it, to create it, etc. And again, I mean, I guess my view has always been, Joe, and I'll say it again. All of these, if we do all of this, it still won't solve the livability issue unless we address some of the core concerns that have been expressed. So I would really like to see a little bit more focus on that.
Like, for instance, give me a specific.
Instant, better enforcement on parking / or a number of occupants in party houses.
Okay.
How do we do that? Do we have a complaint process? How robust is it? Do we track it, etc.? And think, how do we deal with maybe putting up some more signage for informing people about the scoop law, so that we have fewer issues about dog poops everywhere else. How do we make sure the owners of STRs and managers of STRs inform their residents of some of the key rules and the fines associated with that, to try and sort of take care of any issues before they become an issue. So I think the good neighbor letter is good, but we also need to strengthen that to say, and by the way, I get it if I go state someplace, I get told, here are the rules. and here are the fines if you violate the rules. So we shouldn't be shy about some of that stuff. But I think that my philosophy has always been is, if you can get voluntary compliance as much as possible, it'll help everybody. And it's not just an STR issue, it's also, second homeowners, could be visitors, could be hotels, who knows, the variety of things.
I don't think you get
just wanted-
anybody who disagrees with you.
Yeah,
Right.
we'll agree.
Yeah, I think the issue is, how much can we do by July? How much can
Yeah,
we
and I'm
present
saying,
to council by
that
July?
some of these things I think are going to be easier to address and put forward. I think the density and proximity issue is going to be a longer conversation, and quite frankly, more technical conversation. That's all I'm suggesting.
So Anupam, I think I really support your comments. I think you're right. One of the things that I would like in the presentation to the city council, because the city council in the first outreach to in preparation for short-term rental included density as a key issue. So if we could say in that, depending on where we are, this is why we haven't addressed density at this point, and this is what we're going to do in the future, so that the council is clear that you're considering it, but because of the complexity, it's going to take a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that's great. That's perfect, because I think we're not going to drop it. I'm not suggesting we drop it. I'm just suggesting let's deal with some of these issues directly, including things like readable ordinance and stuff. And maybe there's some other issues that come up that are ordinance issues, that we put into that bucket and do it once rather than multiple times amending the ordinance. So,
And I guess I'm going to suggest that we try, in the same way that we tried, a couple of us on the old group tried to get go bags in every home. We tried really hard. And at the end, we said, can't get there from here. We're going to have to look at it later.
Yeah.
My suggestion is we try with density. If we can't get there, and we're not going to answer all density proximity questions, but if we come up with a concept for part of it, then we do. If we don't, we drop it. We say exactly what Linda said. We tried, it's too complicated. We're going to have to take more time to deal with this.
Okay.
Shara?
I support that. Oh, whoops. Am I? Okay. I support that. And I feel like our last few meetings, when we've tried to look at caps or percentage or those bigger issues, we get spun into the density question. So I think Joe is right. We ought to put it in there. We ought to have some initial thoughts about it. We can move forward with it. We may not get to a point where we all agree on and land exactly, but I feel like our work, if we keep doing things in isolation, we are getting bogged down by concerns about this, by density and ordinance. And so I think we need to give it a try as a committee to just follow this outline here and see where we get. Because I like having this outline, Joe. I think it focuses our meetings. It creates I think a level of responsibility for committee members to be communicating ahead of the meetings. And if you miss a meeting, you can go back and see where things are so that we're all up to speed kind of moving forward instead of, this 1 step forward, 2 steps back kind of thing, because we're getting distracted. So that's just my 2 cents. But I agree, it's complicated. And I think we have this issue that we have to get around. And of course, the livability, I support that. There are definitely some particular things that can be addressed for that down the road or in the context of our next few meetings.
Absolutely.
Patrick?
Yeah, and as a side note, I really like just kind of a vision of where we're trying to go and kind of the order we're going to go. And to Anna Palm's point, I think, all these things are important. I think to get it done, though, we have to kind of have an order and try to work through that. And density, I agree with Anna Palm. That seems, I don't know that in one meeting we're going to be able to solve that. But what Joe asked me to do is she said, could you do some research on what everybody else does on the North Coast? So I actually have a survey, basically a community survey that goes. I just tried to do it, a couple cities up and a couple cities down from us. I ended up going all the way across the river to Longview, Washington, down to Coos Bay, and I cataloged every different way that people do density in those areas. So this is just information. Here's all the things that people use, and we don't have to follow anybody's lead. We get to take a look at it critically, objectively, go, does this work for us? Does it not? But at least it was I'm trying to save some time on research and have that for us. And then going back down to the end where we have to present it to Linda and everyone, to your point, Anna Palm, this is complex. If we can't fix that by then, which is pretty aggressive, we at the very least have this list that shows here's all the things we've looked at. Here are the things maybe we've said these don't exactly work for us. Here are the things we say maybe these are the things we're considering, and at least we share that with Linda and the council to say this is on our agenda. We're looking hard at it, and I think we have a path forward.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I completely support that approach. So thank you.
Michael, I think you're on, and if he goes over 10 minutes, are you guys all good? Because we kind of mushed him together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anybody need to leave? Cheryl?
I have to leave.
Okay, listen as long as
I
you can.
apologize.
Yeah,
but
and then
I
you can watch the video.
Can I fast forward to the end?
Yeah.
No, nothing personal, but I'm
I think most people ask that when I get talking. All right. So Joe, do you want me to just kind of jump in and I'll try to get through?
Yeah, you want me to put up the talking point thing?
Yeah, let's put up the document. And so just a real quick background on what we're looking at today is, I was trying to think of what ultimately are we going to, put ahead of council, and what does that decision-making framework look to them and to us, and to you know, kind of clarify and at least start to chunk these topics off, because they are so intertwined. I mean, we just had this discussion around density proximity, and it's like, man, it's so hard to parse that out. So, so there it is. Okay. And I wanted to say that the content that's in here has been restructured. I think I might have used the word reset button when I was thinking about this. And we have the appendix that has all the original content in it too. And we just kind of parked it there because we're looking for opportunities how we can fold that back in. And I think we will fold in a lot of that content when we get here. So this is going to feel very focused, with respect to that. But we have a purpose section, which I think we're all kind of familiar with, has our, why are we doing this? And then it's really organized into 3 sections. And today we're really going to focus on section 2 and the first part of section 3, if I can get to it. So we have some historic current policy context. We have a very quick recap of survey findings, some regional information about regional policy context. And I think there might be an opportunity to still edit that paragraph to make sure that what's in there is representative of the deep data that we have on it. And then, but one of the things, and this is going back, and I forget, it might have been Mayor Stock or back when they were Councilor Stock, it said, what's the need? We want to make sure we're solving the problem with the policy. And so I wanted to kind of reframe this into a need objective policy type of format. So what is the need? What is the objective? And what is the policy, right? So the need is kind of the problem statement. And we can retool this language too. Nothing is set in stone, but I wanted to at least put something out there for this group to react to that had a clear arc from problem statement or need to policy language. And so, and I'll take a moment to, try to do this quick, but I'll read this. An increase of short-term rentals, either as a percentage of overall housing or as a total number, has potential to impact neighborhood and community character and livability. And that can be positive impacts, right? It brings a diverse group of folks into our community. It could be negative impacts, noise, parking, what have you, right? But I wanted to have that statement in there because I think we've, as a group, have been consistent with that statement. I also wanted to have a statement in here that says a decrease in the number of short-term rentals, regardless of short-term rental percentage of households, negatively impacts city budget. And I think that's consistent with what we heard here. And I think budget will be a critical component in how we, in the policy that we end up advising on. So, so what is the objective? Well, you want to manage the overall number of licensed short-term rentals within Manzanita as a percentage or as with a hard cap, right? We're not deciding that at this point. This is an umbrella policy. As a percentage or hard cap to maintain neighborhood and community character and livability. The management of the number of short-term rentals does not decrease revenue in a way that negatively impacts the city's budget. So it's just an objective that is, call and response. We have a need, what is our objective? And so what does policy look like? Again, an umbrella policy statement that we end up with. And so I took a pass at it and I wrote, city shall, through the regulated licensing of short-term rentals, maintain a quantity of short-term rentals that supports neighborhood and community character and livability and supplies the necessary level of revenue as determined by city. So, and the reason, and so I was pretty deliberate with the language in there, but I am certainly open to modifying it. If we want to wordsmith it, maybe we can do that offline, but if there's, big picture things that are missing from this, I'd like to hear them. It supplies the necessary level of revenue as determined by city, and I thought that was important. So maybe I'll pause there. Hopefully didn't rush through that too much. Maybe give folks a second to reread it.
Questions, comments, anybody?
I have a comment.
I think under the objective where it says the number of STRs does not decrease revenue in a way that negatively impacts the city's budget, I think we need to rephrase that a little bit. Because negatively impacts the city budget, I don't quite understand how, that seems like a very big statement. I think we can fine tune that a little bit.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Well, I didn't say reduce there because I maybe wanted
No,
to
I'm not
leave that
talking-
open for discussion or.
I'm not talking about reducing it. I'm just saying, I mean, I think given that we just have this presentation on the budget, we see that it's a 64% of the budget.
Mhm.
It's climbing. I think there's a way we can just wordsmith it, and I don't even think we can do it today. But the word negatively impacts,
A little bit loaded.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
okay.
that's
Yeah,
fair.
fair point.
That's okay. And if we want to, I mean, there's no reason why we couldn't get into a specific number in there. You know, and maybe it's just maintains current budget assumption or something. I mean, again, we can get to that.
Yeah, again, for the benefit of those that aren't with us and for you, Cheryl, we're gonna put this on the Google Drive and ask for your comments. Not, we don't want everybody editing it, but if you have things like that, if you would comment and say, you know, this sounds pretty harsh. Could it be reworded some other way? And the suggestion of the other way. And we can do that offline, but yeah, I agree.
Can I put in 2 cents on that?
Yeah.
Just given what Linda and the council want us to accomplish by June and July,
Mhm.
my 2 cents are this. We have some great writers and minds on this team, and I think we'll be able to kind of wordsmith, you know, in the second quarter. I think, like, hopefully, when we look at these, we're focusing not necessarily on semantics and typos. This isn't to you, Cheryl, but like what you're saying is super important. I hope we focus as much as we can too on just the issues. What are the big issues we're trying to accomplish as we knock out at these things, and we can get to the writing of it second. But I hope that we don't spend so much time editing and wordsmithing that we lose track of trying to kind of figure out the policies. That
I
are
hear
the
you.
critical part.
I hear you. I think it goes beyond wordsmithing in terms of, I
Good.
think what we're trying to do is take a positive approach to this.
Right.
And so I think we can reword things that are negative to take a positive spin on it, which not only is wordsmithing, but also I think impacts the way we're going to think about things down the road.
I
Oh,
agree
and
with
real
you,
quick, I
Cheryl,
apologize,
and part of what we did in the last week was take out as much of the hyperbole as we could. But we need to keep doing that because it needs to be the facts, ma'am.
And my apologies, my comment wasn't about you, Cheryl. It was about the comment about we're going to go through this document, which is, I don't know, 10 pages long. And there's a lot of words stuff we can play with, but for me, it'd be really interesting to hear, like, where do people stand on these issues and things like that we're trying to figure out. And once we figure out the issues, where do we stand on these? Here's the type of process we're going to use. Here's the level we're going to do that at. Then we can spend more time on the words on how to describe how that works, maybe. But that was just more about the document, the 10-page document itself, not what you
Okay.
said.
May I just have one comment, Joe?
Mhm.
Michael, thank you for organizing this in a clear, easy to follow approach. And I appreciate what you've done here. So thanks.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And I hear, Patrick, what you're saying. For the sake of today, we got 6 minutes left. We'll think big picture now, but as you dig into the document and the drive, I do feel, you know, it's the why not both thing. So as we look into that, let's try to have that initial filter of big issues. Does this make sense at that 10,000 foot level? But I do think leading up to a council work session, we're at a point where words matter. And some of this stuff will become policy language that gets cut and pasted into you know, a resolution that council will look to do. So I want to be real deliberate too. So let's do both. But today, let's scoot through this. Okay, so section 3 is policy implementation. And the reason why I was trying to organize it this way is because you have this umbrella policy that I think generally, that we're good with that policy direction. But within that, we have these supporting policies. And in my mind, and this is, we had 2 really good discussions, but at the end I was just, it was exhausted at the past couple of meetings, and I was trying to put this into something that we could flow through. And really I was trying to say is that we have several policy focus areas. One is how the mechanics of how we manage short-term rentals, like how we manage the growth of them, right? Percentage-based, static cap, you work to it, that number, and the other is kind of set there, and whether we want to call it a fixed limit or fixed ceiling, I think is a terminology that we have. And then you have another focus area, which is around the density proximity. You have another focus area that creates a policy around how you implement it, whether it's citywide or excluding C1 R4 zoning, as we've done in the past. And then eventually we get to what that limit is. And the hope is that we can, and I'm not trying to have silos here, but to the extent that we can move forward, once we decide on the mechanics, we can move into these other policy areas that eventually build up to that. What is the limit?
Michael, I just want to stop you there to underline what you just said. The idea behind this is to decide on the mechanics first, and then the implementation and the numbers. So until we have mechanics, how could this work? We can't get to the specifics of what the numbers will be. So it's got to be 2 separate issues that relate to each other pretty closely.
Right. And maybe that'll become clear as we move through this document. And so within focus area 1, which is the management of the number of licensed short-term rentals, you have a fixed ceiling, you have a percentage-based, and the parentheses say with a constrained limit. And Layla mentioned earlier in her mind, we do have a limit now, right? It's constrained by the availability of land, developable land. So, but that starts to become nebulous for some folks. And so there's this idea of, well, does it need to be less than that based on community sentiment or other? Percentage option B can do that. Option C is the status quo. It's sometimes called the no build option. It's the existing policy. So, and then option D, maybe after today or once people dive into this document, we have a combination of these. So that's the structure of focus area 1, which again is the mechanics of regulating the growth of licensed short-term rentals.
You want to skip to 2?
Skip to
rather than going through these 3 options and getting into that, just go to the next focus area.
Sure. So focus area 2, as I mentioned, this is kind of how we laid out now, and this fits with Joe's timeline that she presented there, is the density and proximity of short-term rentals. There's not a whole lot of content right here. I think there will be eventually, but it's a look at policy options for implementing density and proximity policy. We can skip to 3. I don't know how much more we want to talk on that. Focus area 3, I mentioned citywide implementation. We pulled that out as a separate policy. Just, and it doesn't have to be, this big lift or arduous process. It could be simply, yes, we will, there's reasoning to implement this policy to C1 and R4 zoning where it had not previously been, and develop some policy language that states that. And then focus area 4 would be the upper and lower limit of short-term rentals. So, and there's a lot of work, a lot of discussion that needs to happen before we get there. And as Joe mentioned earlier, it's tough because when we try to navigate these earlier policies, especially around the mechanics of how short-term rentals grow, it's hard not to start scenario planning and saying, well, you know, what if the cap was 255, or what if we lowered it to 180, or what if it was 350? I mean, and part of that kind of has to happen, but we're trying to chunk this out so we can at least, hey, can we at least all agree on the mechanics of how they grow? Can we at least agree on how, you know, where in the community this policy is implemented? And then we have a placeholder for future issues. And this can be a section in the report to track, you know, those options around policy, like livability issues, whether it's parking, traffic, dog waste, noise, you name it. The livability survey outlined several in there, which we'll move through once we have this core policy framework established. So that's the general. That's like a very big picture. I was really hoping to at least dive in, you know, at least get through the core policy and say, hey, that looks good, and we just need to tweak some words. And where I really expected a more you know, I expect we will have a more robust discussion will be on the policy options A, B, and C. So, and I'll stop there at this time.
Michael, that was marvelously succinct.
Yeah,
Nice
for
job.
me.
Thank you. For anybody, but yes, for you.
Michael, I really appreciate the concept. I think that is a good organizational outline and really helps us stay focused. That was really good work. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I must say that Patrick also put a lot of time and effort into this, and Cheryl and Anupam. This has kind of been it's been a very group effort, and it was fun.
Well, and it shows. I mean, it's
Yeah.
good work.
And it shows that Michael, with his insight on project management, etc., and policy papers,
Right.
you can herd cats.
Are we clear on what the homework is? The homework is to read this. I'll put I've already put the timeline actually on the Google Drive, so you can go back and look at it. And again, it can be tweaked.
And are we waiting till Monday to do that? We have some edits that are still going
Yeah,
into
we're
that.
waiting. I haven't put the talking points, the draft up there. I only put the timeline up there.
Okay, good. So
Because
starting
you wanna
Monday,
add-
we'll have a
yeah.
document to look at.
Yes, and not until Monday. Except that you all have access to the current one, so there you are.
Well, and I know folks will want to jump ahead to some of those future policy areas. And I don't want, you know, I guess get those comments out if you got them, you know, if they need to be put on paper, let's do that. But I also don't want to pull resources from folks who are, you know, trying to gel, you know, policy area 1. So just let's try to move through it in a way that has some process.
And Anupam, if you have suggestions as to where some of those more important items could be placed on the timeline, would you send them to me, and I'll see if we can talk about them and see if we can fit them in there.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Phil, we haven't heard anything from you. You got anything to add?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, thank you. Any audience people, anything to add? I think we've only got one left. Nope, she's not talking either. Thank you all so much. And we'll get this posted as soon as possible. And Layla, if you're still listening, thanks again. I think
Thank
that'll
you.
help us a lot.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good meeting. Well done.
Bye.
Bye.
Well said.
See, Can talk.